expressed by the guests, listeners, and hosts of any program on Word Radio do not necessarily reflect those of ownership, management, or advertisers of this station.
All right, everyone, welcome to this live edition. It is a live edition this Friday morning of Eco Word Magazine. Welcome to our Friday weekly magazine on all issues dealing with environmental injustice or environmental justice at the intersection of such issues as race and class and public health. Today, we're actually going to be talking about housing. We have a live panel, a very special panel lined up for you today. Yes, it is me. It is the voice of Charles Ellison. I'm normally your host, executive producer, and also creator of Reality Check, which airs here exclusively on WURD Radio. It is the home of Black Talk Media. WURD is progressive Black Talk Media. Also, I'm your anchor for City Council Live, which we had yesterday, and then we have Reality Check Thursday. And we're live on 96.1 FM, 900 AM, wordradio.com, Word TV, and Word app. We're doing a very special convening today on the housing crisis and the role that states can play in doing something about the housing crisis or fixing this housing crisis. It's at alarming levels. And so we convened a panel today. We did that in conjunction with the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, or otherwise known as CSG East, the Council on Communities of Color. We appreciate them helping us pull this together and to help produce this. Also is doing in some partnership with Princeton Eviction Lab, and we have one of their members here today as well, the program director from the Princeton Eviction Lab. And this is also being done in partnership, of course, being produced by or powered by EcoWord. Go to ecoword.com. Also sign up for that EcoWord newsletter today when you get a chance. Let's go ahead and introduce the panel. There are some participants who are joining us via Zoom here during this live broadcast. Please stay muted and please stay off camera while we have our panelists have this conversation. However, if you have a question for those participants who are in Zoom, do leave them in the Zoom chat and we'll relay those later on in the discussion. Let's introduce our roundtable today. We have joining us at the top, actually a legislator who's a member of the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, or one of the member states. It's representative or Connecticut State Representative Quentin Williams. He's with the Connecticut General Assembly. Connecticut is a CSG East member, as is Pennsylvania, where WURD Radio is based. Good to see you again, too, Representative. It's been a long pandemic minute, so looking forward to seeing you on the other side of all this, too, particularly when CSG East meets up in New Hampshire later on in August. Also joining us is the director of the Delaware State Housing Authority, Eugene R. Young Jr. Good to see him as well. And then also coming back to us is Rashida Phillips. She's up a little bit earlier this morning out on the West Coast. We appreciate her. She's out there in Northern California. Rashida Phillips with PolicyLink, policylink.org. And many Philadelphians do remember her when she was at Community Legal Services and still doing that housing work on the front lines. Also joining us is Corinne O'Connell, who is Executive Director of Habitat for Humanity Philadelphia, also doing some great work. And we've been having multiple conversations with her about this housing crisis and what she's been doing in Philadelphia. And Carl Gershenson is Program Director for the Princeton Eviction Lab. Some real critical research they're doing as well. at evictionlab.org. So let's go ahead and get the conversation started. Rashida, I do want to start with you, get your reflections on, kind of from a very high aerial view of this housing crisis. How bad is it? When we talk about a housing crisis, how bad is it?
Yeah, so when we talk about how bad it is, right, we have to first acknowledge that there was a crisis that existed before the pandemic, right? And many of us like to locate this moment in time and talk about it in relationship to the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, almost 50% of renters pay more than 30% of their income on rent. And so now, as about 5.3 million renters are estimated to have had at least one member of their household lose a job entirely during the pandemic, we stand to see, this crisis is beginning or has already worsened. And so, just to give you a couple of ways in which we're seeing this crisis deepen, 6 million renter households are currently behind on rent. So that's about double that pre-pandemic baseline that I just talked about earlier. In 2021 alone, we saw rents increase by at least 10% in 149 metropolitan regions, where only 3 metro regions experienced that level of growth prior to the pandemic. Millions of renters currently collectively owe billions of dollars in back rent. Again, we're seeing cities across the United States increase in rent, increase in selling prices, right? So this is not just a crisis that's infecting renters. We're also seeing low income homeowners, right, be at risk of losing their homes, as well as, people not being able to buy homes now because of the increase in selling prices. And then, just other housing insecurity factors, chronic health disparities that have exacerbated, people's impacted people's exposure to COVID-19. And so it's just exacerbating a lot of the situations that already existed. So I'll stop there, but I can go on.
No, it's very fascinating. We're going to follow up shortly on some of that. Corinne, I just get your view, especially you're in Philadelphia, always identified as the poorest big city in the country. And so how bad is this housing crisis from your vantage point? Also, one thing that I notice in a lot of housing conversations or housing crisis conversations is that we always talk about homeowners. We never talk about renters. And we never talk about how renters are impacted. We just automatically assume that we're just talking about home. A lot of housing policy is just shaped by a homeowner's perspective. But just as Rashida said, we've got 6 million plus people out there who are behind on rent. A lot of that aggravated by pandemic. How do we reconcile that?
I mean, thanks for the softball, easy one to get started. How do we reconcile it? I appreciate that, Charles. Good morning, everybody. It's so good to be with you all. So nationally, the housing market itself is a 15-year high. In Philadelphia right now, average home sale price is $255,000. So take a family who is renting, who is paying right now too much in rent, right? So 30% is right, the threshold of where people should be paying housing, be it mortgage or rent. So you're trying to get out of that cycle around rent, but you need to have cash on hand for a down payment. You need to have sterling credit, and you need to have an income that can swing then that mortgage. And so the affordability gap moving, when we think about the housing continuum, families moving out of rental into home ownership just continues to widen. And so more and more families, right, are just like sucked into this vortex. I think what we're also seeing here on the Habitat side of things with families in our program, yes, there is the rising costs of rent, the rising cost of housing, but we're also seeing it in other, right? Transportation, how much people are paying in gas, I see Carl nodding, he probably has more data, right? And how much time are people spending in a commute to get to a job that isn't paying wages, that really merits the job, but that's the job they have. Childcare. So there are these other levers that people do not have any flexibility. There's just no cushion. So that's what I would say. It's a 15-year high in Philadelphia. This market, often other markets say Philadelphia is affordable. Well, that's all relative, right? As the poorest large city in the United States of America, it is not affordable to far too many people in Philadelphia.
Yeah. Yeah. Representative, want to get that Connecticut perspective and how, too, when we talk about or think about Connecticut, we think that that's a rather affluent state, but I know you all are dealing with those stressors and pressures there. How does it look?
So that's a great question. And I think we have the two different sides of Connecticut. You have like the sort of like New England side, and we have the sort of Fairfield County, New York suburb side. And both aren't easy to purchase a home in or to rent. Whether you're a senior and you're looking to downsize, our rental market is pretty much at full capacity, and rents have risen, I think it's over 12% over the last 18 months, which is unaffordable. If you were a new recent graduate and you're looking to rent your first home after your first graduation, once again, really nowhere for you to go. If you want to go back to your hometown, many of our home prices have risen anywhere from 25 to 50%. So as we talked about, getting that initial deposit down, having stellar credit after student loans, so on and so forth. There really isn't a home for anyone at any budget. And the number one thing that I always will remember is when we were first, my wife and I were looking to figure out where we were going to move. My wife is from the Midwest, and I showed her what we could afford in Stanford, and she literally cried, saying it was, I think, 5 times more than what she paid for. It was like 20% of the space that she had in her Kansas City home. And I think this is really indicative of the overall problem that we have. And I have to give a lot of credit to our good friend in New York who said the rent is just too damn high.
Right. Carl, speaking of the rent being too damn high, which it is, and follow up with some of what Rashida and Corinne were talking about, how bad this housing crisis is. And we're policymakers are ignoring this. At their own, it's not so much that they're ignoring it, it's the way that they're tackling it, I guess. And we'll get a little bit deeper into that. But your thoughts on what you're hearing now and how severe this housing crisis is. We're reaching, have we gone over the cliff yet, or are we like just looking over it?
I think that there's no cliff that you get over that will finally get, politicians to act as much as they need to, right? I think like the lesson of the last 10 years, 20 years, we never reached that cliff, and like we need to push them to act. But yeah, the rent is too damn high and incomes are too damn low for a lot of people in the United States. I often find it useful to think of there as being sort of like a dual housing crisis. There's the housing crisis for people who have comfortable incomes, middle class, working class incomes, and they're able to get homes and they have stable lives, but they're just putting way too much money towards housing, right? They're writing big checks that go to banks instead of spending at local businesses and things like that. But there's, a related, but in another way, separate housing crisis, which is at the bottom of the market, people who will never be able to afford market rate housing. And these are people who are going to need government assistance to make the rent. They're going to need public housing, social housing, some kind of program to help these people achieve the stability, the residential stability that so many others take for granted, and really allow them to break out of some vicious cycles.
Yeah, it's still caught up in and trapped in that vicious cycle as well. Director Young, your perspective overseeing an agency that's supposed to tackle this housing crisis in a state like Delaware that's really in many respects like metropolitan Philadelphia. So talk a little bit about that, about how hard that is, how difficult it is.
Yeah, first, thank you all for having me. I'm so honored to be on this amazing panel. A couple of things. One is here in Delaware, we are getting squeezed. I tell a lot of the people from our state, we're getting squeezed from a variety of different perspectives, right? So while we're a small state, less than 1 million people, fun fact, we have more chicken than people in the state of Delaware by a landslide. But I tell people all the time, it's this aspect that we have a lot of people that come from Philadelphia, that come from New Jersey, and that come from New York seeking affordable housing, right? And what we find is that many of the people within our state are being squeezed from the sense where you have people that may have quality earning income in Philadelphia, too hard to find a place in Center City, so I'm going to buy a place or rent a place in Wilmington, just catch the train up or take a little bit longer commute. And what's happening is we collectively from the state's perspective, we don't have enough units. You know, it was a 60 minutes segment a couple weeks ago that said, you know, there's around 4 million deficit of housing stock in our nation. In Delaware, many housing advocates will give you numbers between 12 and 22,000. And while you may seem that's small, but considering that probably our fourth largest state is fourth largest city, is around 20,000 people, it gives you an idea of just how many units we are behind. And so I think some of the things that was touched on earlier are so very true. This isn't just and you said this earlier, this just didn't happen yesterday. This didn't happen 6 months ago. This is something that's been eroding from within our space for the last, I would say, few decades. This is like a 30-year, 40-year issue that I think people have not been necessarily willing to tackle in many cases, and sadly enough, until it becomes them and their family members that can't afford affordable housing in places where they once thought they could.
You know, it's something that Director Young said, everyone on panel and roundtable, and we're still having this today's discussion on the housing crisis. Actually, the title of this discussion too is Unhoused, How Can States Solve the Housing Crisis? We're doing this in conjunction, in partnership with Council of State Governments, Eastern Regional Conference Council on Communities of Color, and also the Princeton Eviction Lab is joining us as well. We have, that was Eugene Young joining us now. He's the director of the Delaware State Housing Authority. Connecticut State Representative Quentin Williams also joining us, Rashida Phillips of Policy Link, Carl Gershenson of the Eviction Lab at Princeton, and also Corinne O'Connell of Habitat for Humanity, Philadelphia. I'm Charles Ellison, hashtag EcoWord for more of that social media conversation there. I'm at Ellison Report on Twitter.com, by the way. For those who are listening in, who are tuning in via Zoom, we do have also a Zoom audience that is that is noticing that we're on a live broadcast. If you have questions, do leave them. If you have questions for the panelists, you can leave them in the Zoom group chat. So please stay off camera and stay on mute and leave your questions in the Zoom group chat during this live broadcast. Something that Director Young was saying, I'll go back around the table, go to you, Rashida, where he was saying that you know, we just don't have enough housing units. Housing advocates are saying we don't have enough housing stock. So I do hear that often about that's one big way to tackle the housing crisis. We need more housing stock, more housing units, need to build more houses. Is that necessarily the case?
No, it's not necessarily the case. And I would just say there's no silver bullet, right? Like we need all these things. We need all these solutions. We definitely need more production, right? But that is not the only answer. And that's the one that for too long we've relied on as an excuse to say, right, like we can't build affordable because there's not enough space, there's not enough land, there's not enough people to build, they can't pencil it out, right? So like all the excuses, right? But it's a part of many different solutions that we need to be thinking about. So not only do we need to be building, we also need to be preserving what we already have. There's lots of naturally occurring affordable housing out there. There's lots of small, what they call mom and pop landlords. There's lots of people already doing this, right? But it's not affordable for them to continue preserving that house, that low affordable housing. And so we have to make this possible for people. One, we also need tenant protections, right? So that people aren't being pushed out of this housing, aren't being evicted, aren't being displaced. But we also need policies that allow communities to take back the land and to have community ownership options, have tenant opportunity to purchase, right of first refusal, enable communities to be able to buy these properties and continue providing them as affordable housing so that communities can remain intact. So there's lots of different policy solutions out there, but I just want to emphasize it is not just about building affordable. We have to layer in lots of different solutions because, you know, as Director Young just talked about, right, we didn't get here overnight, you know, and we like to emphasize and call this like a tsunami and use all these like natural disaster terms. This is not natural. These are all about policy decisions that people have made over time that have gotten us here. And so we need to pay attention to that. And undo those policies, build new models. There's lots of different things out there that we can utilize.
Got it. Corinne, I see you shaking your head. Yeah, and you've talked about this before. Like, it's not just as simple as just building more housing.
Yes to everything Rashida said. So the couple pieces that I would add in there, Philadelphia in particular, we have the housing stock. There's 121,000 owner occupied units in Philadelphia falling down around the families that live there. So it requires
121,000
121,000 units. So like when we think about Director Young, I mean, I know it's the population size and what have you, but when you think about the housing continuum, right? So social and public housing absolutely needed more volume, what have you. We think about people getting into the market, but then there's this whole bracket of folks who, who do own. So there's two pieces in that. One is through preservation of home repairs. So in Pennsylvania right now, State Senator Sabal has put forward a piece of legislation called the Whole Home Repairs Act. And that is something that Habitat is behind that would unlock funding statewide to help preserve the existing housing stock. The other piece, so in Philadelphia right now, there are 10,000, so Rashida, like put your community legal services hat back on, but there are 10,000 homes with tangled titles. And that property value is tied up at 1 billion, or it's valued at 1 billion. And so a strategy needs to be aligned in preserving that asset, working with families. So, we do estate clinics at Habitat in the neighborhood. So it gets to, again, the space of both that asset for the family, but that asset preserved in communities that are experiencing gigantic swings in real estate prices and what have you. So I think as we, look at solutions, both tangled title, if I could wave my magic wand, I would make all 10,000 of them go away, right? Because it unlocks, then people can get to LIHEAP, they can get to other services state and citywide to help preserve that asset. And then the other is, let's go after it with the naturally occurring housing stock.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, 121,000 available housing units. From what I last heard, it was like 6,000 or more people who are housing insecure or homeless in Philadelphia. So it's plenty of housing stock to meet that demand of so many housing insecure people in Philadelphia, in a place like Philadelphia.
Yes, it's the resources to repair, right? Bring it back to, a vibrant, thriving place for people to live.
Right, exactly. Go ahead, Representative, go ahead. You were coming next.
So I totally agree with him. And I would say, but I do think one of the clear activities and behaviors we could do is to build more housing, to help create the framework in which we want the housing to be developed, to make rules around having affordability, to do it in an environmentally friendly way. But in Connecticut, it really is a math problem. It is a economics equation. And right now, when we have a high demand and we don't have a high enough supply, that's why our prices are going up. To me, it's a very simple business economics equation. So I think the first thing that we can do is encourage this sort of affordable housing. And by affordable, I mean, once again, I think our traditional legal definition, but also just making sure that homes are there for every budget in every community. But you can't have that conversation without planning. And I'm glad someone mentioned that in our chat. Right now, one of my favorite new housing developments that I like to point to, it redeveloped the mills. It was environmentally friendly. It was done in a green way. It's near our transit-oriented development district. If we try to recreate that same sort of development anywhere on the Metro North line, which is the line that most folks commute into and out of New York City, you cannot recreate that space anywhere on the Metro North line planning rules. And these are the sort of things, and that's specifically designed, to be frank, to make sure that we don't have more increased density in a lot of our most affluent areas up and down our coast. And that was always done, to be frank, for racist reasons. So I think there's really the two parts. One, the development of more housing. Two, making sure that our planning and development actually allows for the type of housing that we want. And I think the third solution is really around creative financing, both for home ownership and doing it in ways where you don't need to pay PMI or having a 20% down,
Yeah.
and then also helping with the rental market.
You know, I want to unpack that a little bit, Representative. I want to go around the table, talk more about that. I'll go to you, Director Young, on this. Talk about that conversation. It seems like, okay, I understand where the representative is coming from, but I do hear a lot of people starting to wonder if the way that we traditionally go about acquiring a house, the way that the housing market is designed, it's just not equitable. You know, even if we try to create affordable housing, we're still using the conventional or traditional way of buying a house, of just assuming that people are in a position to get a house, and then you know, exactly how are we defining what is an affordable house? If, you know, like, okay, maybe 10 years ago, an affordable house was $100,000. Now an affordable house is $250,000. Like, when does it stop? Like, does it stop with inflation? So, I mean, people do have a lot of questions there. Go ahead, Director Young. And I do want to circle back to you on that question too, Representative.
Sure. So I think a couple great points have been said. Even going back to something that Rashida said, I agree. I don't think it's not the silver bullet. With any of these issues, there's no silver bullet answer. It's going to take it's going to take some on the legislative side. It's going to take some on what are you going to do around NIMBYism in many areas, which for us here in Delaware is a major issue, especially when you get near the beach and our lower counties. How are we going to also make sure that, and I know preservation was brought up, but for us, it's not necessarily preservation of the mom and pops, but also we have, 600 units, 700 units in areas that are now becoming tourist attractions, which were once affordable housing. And so how do we preserve those, preserve that stock to make sure it stays affordable? Because once it's gone, it's not coming back, right? That's 500, 600,000 units that's not coming back. And then kind of dovetailing into your question, one of the things that we're trying to focus on is how do we work in areas, working with habitats and other groups, nonprofit organizations alike, to incentivize to make sure that we're able to get home ownership at such a low number of, AMI, area medium income, so that people can actually purchase said home and move in. So we have a program here in Delaware. It's called our Strong Neighborhoods program, where make a long story very short. A developer comes in, nonprofit developer comes in, purchases a home for $50,000, takes $100,000 to renovate, but the houses in that neighborhood only sell for $100,000. So we, in many cases, will cover that gap, so that first-time home buyer can come in and be able to take advantage of that house at that lower number. And so we're able to get homeowners into many of these housing stocks that are in disarray and disrepair. So we're working with a variety of different pilots of how can we get more people involved and engaged in housing, from the preservation, new homeowners with lower price, deed restrictions in some areas, to keep people from the community in these houses so you don't get a lot of speculation, because that's another part of this as well. But working collectively to tackle some of these issues.
Carl, your thoughts on like that definition of affordable housing. Is the definition that we're working on when we have these kinds of conversations, debates, is that a correct definition? And another question I have too, something that the director was just saying now about, and we talk about different projects where we have to rely on the home builders, on the developers to develop, that kind of affordable housing that we're defining right now. Can we trust them to do that? I do have to ask that. Can we trust? I'm going to throw that out there to the table, so people feel free to step in, but I'm going to go with Carl first. Can we trust them to do that when they're the ones who are not only the builders, but the speculators? They're driving a lot of these gentrification challenges that we're seeing in the displacement. Your thoughts, Carl, first.
Yeah, as for the definition of affordable housing, I mean, that's like a whole can of worms. Everyone has their own opinion.
Right.
Obviously, every different family is going to have a different situation that they consider affordable, right? And we can look at what the income distribution is in various communities. And the idea is that we want to have basically housing stock that can meet, the range of incomes in the community. Mm-hmm. And ideally, we would have sort of mixed incomes, like mixed affordable housing available in every neighborhood, in every suburb, et cetera. But that's not what we see really when we look at how our housing market works, where you have areas of extreme segregated wealth and extreme segregated poverty. This is one of those issues where, the housing stock is there, but if you put all of the resources in one place and you put all of the poverty in another place, you have a situation where the people who fall in the middle, they are all trying to bid up the prices to get into those places with the concentrated resources.
Yeah.
So, I just often think that what we need to do is, aside from all the other great policy ideas here, we need to spread out the amenities more, spread out the demand so that every neighborhood is a neighborhood of opportunity where people would be able to buy into. That is a solution that I think is separate from one that relies on developers, right? That relies on the government to provide services, that relies on communities to come together and create social capital in these neighborhoods.
Corinne, I see a lot of head shaking from you on that question about that definition of affordable housing. But Habitat for Humanity, you guys are nonprofit builders, of course, but it'd be great to get that perspective from still a builder, nevertheless, a home builder, nevertheless, about like who we trust to make that housing affordable, to get this paradigm shift started, so we're not going from a crisis to an apocalypse.
Mm-hmm. So a couple things there. Habitat Philadelphia, and this is most habitats in the United States. So the population and families that we're working with are between 30% of AMI and 80. Mm-hmm. Some of the more difficult places, the Bay Area.
When you say, I'm sorry, Corinne, when you say AMI, what do you mean by AMI?
Area median income.
Area median income. Thank you for that.
Correct.
Yeah, just so the audience knows.
So, a family in the Habitat program right now, they might be working two, hourly wage jobs to make ends meet. They might be like, here's a good example. They're working in the school district or for the school district of Philadelphia in, culinary services. So an essential job that is needed might be a mom with 2 kiddos at $42,000 a year. Mm-hmm. So affordable at $42,000 a year, you can, back of the napkin, start to do some math. How the Habitat program works, both as a subsidy at the close, right, to ensure that affordability. And then the second is that affordable mortgage. So it's a 30-year. So the model itself, we say all the time, it's a crazy one. It is not scalable in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. However, when we think about the historic, we've all, touched on this, Rep. Quinton, of what neighborhoods who had access to what capital, what have you. The generations of people who have been intentionally left behind, Black and brown people, there's a reason that gap and that affordability gap is there. And so on the Habitat side of things is looking at how do we close that gap with that down payment, call it reconciliation, call it remediation, call it reparations, but in that down payment assistance and that affordable mortgage. The mom buying that home or the family buying that home, the mortgage might be $550, $600. We ensure that over the life of that mortgage, it is affordable. No more than 30% of that income is spent on. So again, it is a family by family, affordability is relative to where you are. And I think we need to keep in mind as we think about policies and solutions, when we think about supply, when we think about types of housing models, and I'm with you all, I'm preaching to the choir here, I get it, right? But we need to look at how deeply entrenched and where that wealth has not, and where that capital has not been unlocked, so that people can get their foot in the door to buy. Yeah, exactly. Rashida, that affordable housing definition, and just continuing the flow of this conversation in terms of reconciling this reliance on, it is that how we develop something as fundamental, as essential as housing is through obviously market forces, but it's just, can we trust those market forces?
I think we can trust the market forces to do what they'll always do, right? And what they've always have done, which is what it's best for them and what's best for their bottom line. And doing that in a way that, other people suffer and it ends up extracting from other people's communities. So that's as far as we can trust it, right? Like we can trust they're going to do what they do until things change. And so, just to ground this in a practical example of what Philadelphia is facing right now, we have the University City Townhomes in West Philadelphia that has been held as a so-called affordable property for the past almost 4 decades, right? And due
University
to market
City
forces,
Townhomes.
Due to market forces, right, that developer is opting out of continuing to provide affordable housing and can now put that market on a property for $80 million, right? And so we are in a situation where 70 people in a historically Black neighborhood are going to be displaced in one fell swoop, right? And income extracted, money, just $80 million taken from that community, essentially, right? They are sitting on $80 million worth of assets that they cannot tap into, even though they've lived there and have been in that community and have built up that community for decades, right? And so what kind of model is going to deal with this kind of issue, right? So we need to be piloting those models because we can trust that the market is going to do what it always does until someone says otherwise. And so that calls for, when we talk about what states can do and what cities and governments can do, they have to get bold. They have to get creative. They have to start using, right? They use eminent domain for any other thing they want, right? But they're not using it to preserve affordable housing. They are not facilitating policies that allow communities to buy these properties, right? And to take them off of the private market, permanently, right? So we have to leverage these new models. Governments have to get bold and say where their priorities are, and then build the policies that are going to follow those priorities. We can no longer, act like we don't know what's going on. Governments can no longer do that. We are telling you what's happening and what you need to do to fix it, right? And so anything else is a choice, right? If folks aren't doing the right thing, it's a choice at this point. So
let's talk about potential solutions, and I do want to get to questions soon or later on, very soon in this discussion that we're getting from the audience. There's some folks who are actually joining us in this virtual Zoom environment as we're having a live broadcast here on WURD. This is EcoWord Magazine. We have a live edition of EcoWord Magazine. I'm Charles Ellison. I'm your host, your creator of EcoWord Magazine, also managing editor for EcoWord.com, our environmental justice journalism project. Obviously, one environmental injustice that we are dealing with daily, routinely, especially as Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, especially as distressed, underserved Black communities in a city like Philadelphia, is housing. There is an alarming lack of housing. We should not have this many people housing insecure or this many people stressed. No one should be stressed out about housing, and yet here we are. So we're having a conversation, and we've been continuing to have conversations here on EcoWord Magazine and throughout Word about how to fix that, coming up with those bold ideas. So let's talk about those bold ideas. State Representative, going back to you in terms of, you heard one particular bill in Pennsylvania. You might be following that, one of your colleagues in the Council of State Governments East Region. It could be the first bill of its kind that's passed by a state where it's, that Whole Home Repairs Act, where it's acknowledging that, we need to just work with what we've got, fix these homes, particularly that are owned by low-income homeowners, repair them, fix them, weatherize them, prepare them for climate crisis changes and impacts. That's one idea. Another thing to think about, going back to Rashida's scenario where she talked about what's happening in University City townhomes in West Philadelphia. You cannot develop, you can't sell properties, you can't flip houses unless you have a plan to not displace people. Like that. So, what are some things, that like you as a state legislator are looking at or working on right now as far as fixes to this crisis?
Yeah, so there's several bills that we're looking at right now. One is around transit-oriented development, having greater density and affordability around our major Metro North line. That is a bill that is being, as I said, fought tooth and nail from some of our most affluent communities for, once again, just blatantly racist reasons. Another bill that we're working on, and I think we have to also reframe about how we're talking about developers. Rashida, I think Rashida nailed it, right? That the market is going to do what it always does, which is maximize their profits. She is unquestionably correct. And I have this weird thing that when people say things, I actually believe them for what they say. So when developers say, we just want to play by the rules. If you tell us what the rules are, we will develop based within those parameters. So it's, I think, as she said, we have to make sure that we put those parameters in place to make sure that they are affordable, make sure that things are done in a environmentally friendly way, so on and so forth. So one bill that we have is to empower, I think, one of our greatest assets here in Connecticut, our public housing authorities, and allowing them to develop outside of their municipality. Currently, Connecticut, for those that don't know, we do not have county government. Everything is done at the municipal level. So in New Haven, they can only do New Haven, but they can't do West Haven, East Haven, Guilford, Madison, so on, all the towns that are right outside. Same thing in Hartford. Hartford can't do things in Simsbury or Glastonbury or East Hartford or West Hartford. So the folks that have the most capacity to build the housing that we want in an affordable way, in a way that actually works, their hands are completely tied. And that's not even just for our big cities. Even our smallest towns that only have 7,000 people, each have their own individual housing authority. And if your neighbor that also has only 7,000 people and you would want them to do housing in your town, you can't do it. And I think that's probably one of our most important bills to get across the finish line. I don't think we'll be able to get it done this year, but but next year it's going to be the first one out the gate.
Yeah. Director Young, your thoughts on, especially you overseeing the Delaware State Housing Authority. And so, I mean, you're overseeing this, one, you're watching this crisis unfold from a pretty unique position. And then two, you got to juggle, you got to manage so many different pieces to try to stop the hemorrhaging. I mean, there's obviously some bleeding that's going on there in terms of the amount of unavailable housing, but how do we fix that? How are you fixing that?
Sure. So first and foremost, I always say my first priority is always to keep people in their homes. Number one, keeping people in their homes, and that comes through a variety of ways with us. We get out around $1 million to $2 million per week in the rental assistance from the U.S. Treasury. We've worked with our local Class C here, Community Legal Aid Society, to focus on eviction defense project, helping tenants who have issues who are brought to court so that there is some type of representation. So they're able to have like a equal playing field in the legal process, working with also our courts to make sure that if someone comes into our courts or justice of the peace courts around eviction processes, making sure we have money is not an issue. So if using the ERA funds that we've received from U.S. Treasury to make sure that money is not an issue for getting anyone being evicted. And then also working to make sure that, similar to what was said a little earlier, we're working with local municipalities. In particular, our largest city has just opened up a pilot around, they call it, I think it's like some type of healthy neighbors program, but it's focused around roofs, windows, porches, and HVAC, something of that nature, to assist families and homeowners in local areas. And so that's the aspect of keeping people in their homes. The second part is going back to what the representative said, working with developers and creating the rules in regards to getting more affordable stock available, right? That's a major part of it as well. So whether it's through, as I said earlier, the program that we have, the Strong Neighborhoods program, working with local nonprofit developers, just getting more units up and available. And then third, working with our legislature and local municipalities around issues, because it's very big, in particular in areas of our two lower counties around zoning and municipality laws, regulations, essentially NIMBYism that prohibits. I mean, I speak with developers all the time to say, I work on one neighborhood. The moment I put together plans for a neighborhood next to it, I get the first neighborhood pushing back, saying we don't want another neighborhood next to ours. And so these are some of the issues that we see. So for me, it's keeping people in their house, keeping people in their home, working on more housing stock available, working also on legislation that allows more for a better climate for us to actually get more units. Because for us, it's just it's more of a it's a variety of issues, but it also comes down to that unit number. Just not we're just getting squeezed out from I can't say enough. Like we have people from Maryland and New York, my in-laws.
That's
they
right.
moved down here from New York. God bless them.
Y'all are sandwiched between multiple metropolitan markets. I mean, it's not just Philly, but you're getting it from, because I know people like personally in places like suburban DC who are like, oh, I just found some cheaper house, and I'll just hop on the Amtrak or connect to, I mean, SEPTA's making that connection between Maryland and Pennsylvania. I can just connect from Mark to SEPTA and just do it like that, or take that drive on the back end. If I'm not taking 95, I'll take the old Blue Star Memorial Highway, like my grandmother did. So yeah, it's like, because they're finding this cheaper house, but that's only going to last for so long.
It's only going, and it's already putting immense pressures on our market. So you have to think. The best way, anecdotal way I could describe it is, I had a meeting with a pastor that wants to do affordable housing, and we're having a conversation. And I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "I'm from Jersey." He said, I said, that's amazing. Where you live? I live in the area of Middletown, Townsend area of Delaware. But he said, 85% of my congregants are from out of state. And so this is, the situation that, we have. While it's good to have people coming to the state, but also it puts pressure so that now, I mean, for someone who normally lived in this area, the numbers are just going through the roof, and they can afford a 2, 3, God forbid, a 4-bedroom home in many of these areas.
Corinne, your thoughts on like that? So you mentioned it earlier on, the Whole Home Repairs Act. We did invite Senator Savall, and unfortunately, I know he would have joined us, but his schedule couldn't accommodate it. Because we did, but we have talked here on Eco Word Magazine. We've have had a discussion with Senator Savall about that Whole Home Repairs Act. So that's one. State of Pennsylvania, looks like he's getting like bipartisan support for that. So I mean, what are some other ideas here that we need to be putting out on the table? Bold ideas, as it was said earlier, that could really stave off an even worse crisis, or an apocalypse, if you will.
So there are a couple pieces. One, in the state of Pennsylvania right now, both the rainy day fund as well as the money received through ARPA. Right now, Pennsylvania's balance sheet is the strongest it has ever been. And there is an opportunity then for, state government to boldly act in the space of affordable housing. So State Senator Hughes is advocating, he says, let's put 800 million of it into affordable housing. And so that is certainly something that Habitat is behind. I don't know that we will ever see a moment like this again on the state balance sheet. And the long-term return on affordable housing, be it rental, right, through LIHTC deals and affordable ownership, but that long-term return is not that long off. So you and I, Charles, have talked about this before. There's a University of Pennsylvania study that's demonstrated that one home on one block repaired, crime is reduced 22%.
Right.
So Philadelphia right now, gun violence is skyrocketing. And there is a lot of like, what do we do? How do we do? Pump that state money into repairs, move that whole Home Repairs Act along. Let's repair, right? Let's repair, let's try it. The data is there to support that. So that's one, again, in that there's an immediate, there's a medium, and there's a long-term return on that from those state dollars. The other is that Habitat is advocating that the increase the cap on fair funding. So that comes through realty transfer taxes. But again, fair funding is the type of subsidy affordable home builders, even market rate developers need fair dollars to help, to pencil how to bring that project up and out of the ground. So, they're the two or the three, from the whole Home Repairs Act side to cap funding with fair. And then in that rainy day fund, there is opportunity and there's an obligation to move on it now.
Yeah. Carl, your thoughts as far as like what states could be doing that's bolder. You're looking primarily at evictions, but one big step could be if Pennsylvania passes, puts into law that whole home repairs act. But do we need to also, you know how we talk about rent controls? And people feel like, well, that's the way to keep the rent from being so damn high, right? Just rent control. Do we need to revisit that in a stronger way? Do we need not just rent control, rent caps? Do we need caps on housing markets? Do we need caps on how expensive or how high the price of a house can be?
Yeah, the way I look at it is, in the United States, we have some states, some regions, let's say like the Sun Belt, the South, that have really leaned into this, like build, build, build. They have a lot of supply, and that keeps homes there relatively cheap. But they have very few tenant protections, no rent control, no rent stabilization, anything like you're talking about. Then we also have a set of states that are supply constrained. They're not building enough. In California, the median price of a home is, God knows what right now. But they do have strong protections for tenants and so forth. I would love to see some states adopt both of these strategies at the same time. It's something that I think Oregon has recently done, where they legalized apartments everywhere. So you can't have an exclusive suburb that's trying to keep out apartments like that anymore. At the same time, they passed good cause eviction laws at the state level, and they stabilized rent increases at 7% a year, which is still pretty high, but we've seen what rents have done over the last year. There's a whole lot of places in the United States that would be better off if they had 7% rent stabilization in 2021. So these are both things that state legislatures have the power to do. They can set rent control, rent stabilization. They can reconfigure landlord-tenant law to give more power to tenants, and they can force exclusionary suburbs, especially those that have rich transit, to legalize apartments. And they can have, fair share inclusion acts, where if a certain suburb is not allowing any affordable housing within its borders, the state has sticks that it can use to force those communities to allow the affordable housing in, because some of these places, there's not enough carrots in the world that would encourage them to bring the affordable housing in. But state legislatures have the sticks if they're willing to use them.
Absolutely. So I want to go to some of these questions, and we're going to start opening up the questions to the audience. That is some of that audience. We do find there are a few state legislators in this audience that's joining us via Zoom for this conversation entitled Unhoused: How Can States Solve the Housing Crisis? Come to find out, states can play a very significant role in helping to fix this housing crisis. And this is the first of a number of conversations that we will be facilitating. We are facilitating this conversation, or powering this conversation, in partnership with the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, the Council on Communities of Color, of which I am a senior fellow. Just a point of disclaimer there. And go to at csg-erc.org for more information on them. And anyone who listens to Reality Check knows that we talk quite a bit about what they talk about at these very important high-level Council of State Government conversations. And it's a privilege to be able to bring these conversations to the WURD audience. You don't get this anywhere else but WURD, by the way. So we are live on EcoWord Magazine, having a conversation about the housing crisis. So real quick before I go to you, Rashida, I do want to, we did have a participant in Zoom, because we're going to those questions in the Zoom group chat. So please, participants on Zoom, leave it in the Zoom group chat. Zoning code prevents the creation of housing stock growth and inflates rents. So that's one participant, John. Joe Kazaka, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, is also asking, are land banks being utilized in Philly to clear title? And CSG East, also our Debbie Ann Page, who's director of the Council of Communities of Color, who is doing a wonderful job. This would not be possible without Debbie Ann Page, by the way, but she's asking, what about those places that are traditionally rural without the housing stock? So we'll start there. Go ahead, Rashida, if you want to kind of respond to her or kind of unpack a few of those comments and questions.
Sure. I think maybe one of the ones I can respond to is around land banks, and actually maybe Corinne, you may have some thoughts around land banks as well. Land banks, I believe, are being utilized in Philadelphia, but they need to be expanded, and the rules need to be made so that they're more accessible to people, because it is really challenging to get land through the land banks, and often they have been used for developers to just kind of do the same things that they normally do, or build housing that still is not really affordable to folks who have lower incomes. So yes, they are being utilized, but they definitely need to be reformed and expanded, and the rules made a little better. But I'll pass it to my co-panelists.
Yeah, go ahead, Corinne.
So just yesterday, there was a press conference. Daryl Clark and Fedulin announced a city initiative for 1,000 affordable units of home ownership, and partnering with the city land bank. So lots to unpack there. It's headline news to me. And at the same time, when we think about, bold leadership and cities stepping in, but that would be if and when, let's be right, speak it into existence. When that happens, for the city to unlock and build and help subsidize, it's the exact Habitat model. And Charles, you and I have talked about this, right? So it's a 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath with a subsidy, energy efficient home. But that's the type of bold leadership that the housing crisis does require. In the more immediate right now, yes, the city does have a land bank. There's 500,000 vacant parcels in the city of Philadelphia. The process is intentional, so that it is, I'm being intentional about how I'm choosing my words, right? It's to be an equitable process to acquire, and it's cumbersome. So I can speak on the habitat side of things. One of the restrictions in place to unlock the land through the city land bank, you need to demonstrate full funding that you can start and complete the project, which on one sense that makes sense. But as an affordable home builder, which I talked about our model, there's no profit in it for habitat. So for us to amass the type of capital to unlock the land, that's a hurdle, that's a barrier. So I do think that there are ways, and we continue to advocate with the city and the city land bank, that the tool would be more effective and more efficient.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Darryl.
Can I interrupt? So I'm in agreement with everything that you just said, especially around land banks. We've been working with our local land bank here in the city of Wilmington around and local developers, and developing what does that look like? How do we get, we're even working to get put some down payment assistance in order to help many of these homeowners in coming into their first homes after being renovated. So I think that's a major piece. That's another piece of the puzzle. I think one thing I would like to present is that, while we even discuss housing, I think we have to when we talk about solutions, we still have to take a step back and recognizing the fact that it's people that end up going into these homes. So we need to strengthen the lives of people, because what's happening is we're in a situation right now where, the lack of wealth, when we talk about, why people are having such hard time, there's such a lack of wealth in Black and Latino communities. I always refer, there's a report, Forbes magazine, September 11th, 2017. Forbes magazine, September 11th, 2017. And if you just Google that and say Black and Latino wealth 2053, it talks specifically about the median wealth of Black families being 0 by 2053. And this is before what we know as COVID, right? And if you listen to economists like Derek Hamilton or at the New School, or Sandy Darity at Duke, they'll tell you that, it's looking now that, especially through COVID, it's certainly looking even more grim, because there are a lot of families that are on the front lines, not being paid enough. And while inflation goes up, dollar can't grab as much at the supermarket or local deli. So the reason why I'm saying that is raising the minimum wage, better protections, opportunities for people to proper job training, things of this matter are very helpful in being able to provide families with the income and the wealth, the means to actually still be able to rent and still be able to take advantage of affordable units, first-time home buyers, and all that aspect. Because we can have all the units in the world, but if more people who just have money and those who can't get it, it just fills into this it just perpetuates this larger cycle as we move forward.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. A representative, going back to as far as, real quick, I just want to kind of go to some of these questions because I am seeing some questions pile up here, and so I'm going to throw these out to our panelists. Sterling Johnson's asking, can you point to a place where this demand supply price equation actually plays out? New York City, San Francisco, and DC have thousands of empty vacant luxury condos. Look at the example of what happened in the NOMA, that's the Northern Massachusetts Avenue District in DC. While there are new encampments right by Union Station, I'm talking about the experience in DC over the last 10 to 12 years. Sterling's very correct. The demand supply has not played out in an equitable way. Yes, and how do we take into account the issue of Airbnb short-term rentals? Just want to consider those parts of the market as well. Anybody want to take a stab at that? On that question, especially as you were looking at like New York City, San Francisco, DC. Carl, I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I'm not expert in any of those housing markets, but I do think if you look at the statistics over the last year where we have had record low vacancy rates, never 0% vacancy rates, right? But like a healthy housing market has well above 5% vacancy rates. We've been nowhere near that the last year. And this is the same year in which we have seen, I think 12% year over year increase in rents. Markets like New York and San Francisco are so in demand that they will soak up all the luxury housing you can build there, because there are extremely well-paid, upper class professionals who are roommates right now. The second a new apartment opens up, they form a new household, right?
Yeah.
And these markets are so supercharged that we are not going to be able to find market solutions to, let alone lower income people, even middle income people. Like, that's how dysfunctional these housing markets are. People need subsidies and government programs to make those places affordable. But that said, I think there still is a clear relationship in the overheated prices we see in those areas and the relative lack of supply to meet demand.
Yeah. Go ahead, State Representative.
I think there's a clear pattern that many of us have said on the panel, that this is not a silver bullet solution, right? That you have to have all the different pieces. You're going to have to build additional housing stock. You're going to have protections for consumers. We're going to have to change our planning and zoning codes to allow for the housing that we want. We're going to have to work with and incentivize developers and empower the developers we want to build the housing that's going to build the housing that we actually want. It's a multifaceted solution. It's not going to be just one. And I did want to point out one other bill, 5204 here in Connecticut, which doesn't go as far as rent control or rent stabilization, but it is a rent commission. So for those that do have that have a concern, whether it's through their home not being up to code or their rents having significant increases, you at least will now have a unbiased place to go to be able to have your voice heard, so you can have those conflicts navigated. And I think that is probably a model that we can move to in order to get us to rent control at one point or another.
Real quick, Representative, expound on that a little bit as far as like the role of state governments, legislatures, to find those solutions, because you're absolutely right. Not so that is a common sort of reoccurring theme in this conversation. There's no silver bullet. It's going to be a variety of different solutions or ways to resolve this. But of course, you're not dealing with this as intensely in Connecticut as in other states. But are states really up to the task, right? I mean, can they rise to the occasion when you have like state legislatures mostly these days focused on, if they're not trying to delegitimize a legitimate election, they're, busily trying to suppress people's votes. I mean, we've had an astronomical increase in the number of voter suppression bills that have been passed since 2020. And or they're trying to ban books or ban critical race theory in K through 12 schools that does not exist. It's like totally manufactured crisis. So they seem to be a lot of state legislatures, it seems like almost the majority of state legislatures seem to be preoccupied with other things. So can state legislatures rise to the occasion on this?
Can they? Yes. Do they need to? Absolutely.
Right.
Is
Are
it
they?
hard not to be cynical and unhopeful? Of course, right?
Right.
I said
right.
even in my own home state, Connecticut, which is one of a blue state, a progressive bastion. Even as we made significant protections to codify our protections for reproductive rights and reproductive justice, how many bills did we get to actually produce more housing or to protect people in housing?
Yeah.
One major bill. And that one hasn't even crossed the finish line in the Senate, right? Even as we all know, we have a major housing crisis throughout the entire state of Connecticut, whether you're talking about Fairfield County or Greater Hartford County or more Eastern Connecticut. Everywhere there is not enough housing for all budgets, period. And yet we have not produced a single bill to get across the finish line in both chambers. So I trust me when I say that I understand how heartbreaking it is and how frustrating it is when we don't do our jobs in the legislature, even as folks will agree and say, we do need more affordable housing, we need more housing. But the favorite word for a lot of my colleagues in that room is the word but. And I always say that but is an acronym for beholding unadulterated truth. And everything that they say before the but, just ignore and just pay attention to the last part, because they're going to tell you all the reasons why we can't do more affordable housing. I'm going to tell you all the reasons why we can't do transit-oriented development. They're going to tell you all the reasons why we can't have protections for people in their rents and making sure that it's fair. And I think that, and I said, so I trust me when I say that I share the frustration.
Yeah.
But I think that gives us even more of a reason why we have to work harder, continue building the relationships, and hold people accountable for the things that they said.
Right. The things they say and do. That's a T-shirt. Behold unadulterated truth. But I gotta do that. So John was. Right, John, right, there we go. John, who was a participant in the Zoom, was leaving a comment here, which I want to share this with the audience, the larger broadcast audience. He's saying, everyone should be able to be a family wealth generating developer, including the poor, through sweat equity by letting everyone who owns a single family property convert it themselves into duplexes, triplexes, quads, multi-use. He's later saying that everyone who can swing a hammer and turn a wrench. It's un-American to prohibit people from safely improving their homestead. Okay, so and Rashida, I'll go to you on this question or on that comment to react to it. I was having this conversation with Peter Saunders, our urban planning expert who's based up in Chicago. He's in Bloomberg from time to time. We were talking about like the phenomenon now of house flipping. I just feel like, we're in this unsustainable moment in housing, and there's like this big push for everyone. Like there's just this expectation that everyone should own a home and everyone should house flip. But I think that that's also creating, in large part, a really unsustainable situation here. Like, I mean, at some point we're going to have to stop that or kind of pump the brakes on a lot of that activity without, stymieing people's ability to generate wealth. I mean, but we've got to find a balance here, because the type of activity that we're engaged in right now, people house flipping, they can't even afford the house flip. And so they can't afford the house flip. So they then let their property get bought out by a corporate investor. Suddenly people in their neighborhood are getting displaced. I mean, there's a lot of activity that's here that's engaging in gentrification, displacement, and people's inability to afford homes. Go ahead, Rashida.
Yeah, I mean, to that comment, and I understand the sentiment perfectly, right? But the fact is, not everybody can wield a hammer. Not everybody can, turn a screwdriver. We have disabled folks, we have young people, we have all kinds of folks, right, who need to be housed. And it's not about production. It's not about whether or not they can get into the market and flip as well, right? We need a fundamental shift in our values, right? So much of the emphasis on having a home is about wealth building. It is almost never, right, when we're talking about the conversation about closing the wealth gap and all this and that. It's obvious, it's a worthy, goal, but it should not be our foremost goal when we're talking about housing, because we do it at the expense of families who are not going to be able to engage in the market in the way that it's currently shaped. And so for me, it's about shifting that value, right? What are we valuing when we're talking about why people need homes, right? Centering people back into homes, not the property itself as the vehicle. shifting our conversation about wealth. It should not be about individualized wealth anymore, right? Like we can talk about anti-capitalism, and we know capitalism is what it is, right? But we're not talking about how we shift our fundamental values around that. And so if we're going to talk about wealth building, let's talk about community wealth building. Let's talk about community assets, right? Let's take away this atomized version of building wealth. Let's all be millionaires. Let's all have our fiefdom in the middle of town, right? And let's talk about how we build community wealth and assets back, and stop extracting from Black and Brown communities, so that we can have what Carl talked about earlier. Every community is a community of opportunity. It's not just about your proximity to the suburbs or your proximity to people with wealth or white people. Every community, people have a choice about where they want to live. And if that choice is in North Philly, right, they have the same opportunities and same access to someone who lives in Center City, Philadelphia, right? So that's the level I'm on when I'm thinking about these issues.
Corin, you'll go ahead and weigh in on that. And then Carl,
Yeah, so, and again, I come at a micro level, and at the same time, so community building, yes. One of the pieces we've looked at Habitat, so our economic impact was valued at 9.7 million. And we've gotten even more intentional. So like thinking about the marketplace, thinking about developers, what's the carrot, what's the stick? But one of the places that we've seen a pinch point, right, in the supply chain of this are minority women, disabled business owners, to be able to contract with Habitat, to be able to repair steps, to be able to repair roofs. So we've worked, it's like, how do we lean in closer to partners, contractors, and how do we help bring contractors closer to Habitat? So playing that out, it's like, all right, our dollars, so yes, homes repaired for that family in that home, but also the welder who is doing the metal railing on the front porch in West Philadelphia, who is paid on time by Habitat, who can then pay his employees by Habitat. So that's where you start to see some of that ripple effect. So I want to echo Rashida, and I know we're all in this, of affordable housing. It is a community builder. Like, it is an economic driver. It is a workforce development strategy. So I wish that I'll get off my soapbox after I said this, but the fear, right, of what's going to happen in my backyard, the NIMBYism. I'm going to steal this line I heard at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, right? If we're too afraid of what's in my backyard, it's going to be in our front yards. Right? People experiencing homelessness, people experiencing housing insecurity will then be in our front yards. So getting off my soapbox, back to others.
No. Carl, you had a comment, and then I do have a question for Director Young. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, I just wanted to, jump on what Rashida was saying and just emphasize there's such a tension between when we think of housing as a place where we live and housing as an asset. And when we talk about the affordability crisis, we want homes cheaper because we want more people to be able to live and enjoy them. But there are so many people who also think of their home as an asset. They want it to appreciate and appreciate and appreciate. And why is that? If you ask them, they say, well, that's the best way for me to save for my retirement. It's the best way for me to save for my kids' education. It's the best way to have savings if I have a health emergency. And this is where you think, if we had a functioning social safety net, you don't need to worry about saving for your retirement. You don't need to worry about affording college. You don't need to worry about an unexpected health expense. And then people would be choosing to live in the communities where they want to live, in the communities that are best for them, and not in the communities where they're saying, what is how rapidly is my home going to appreciate in value over 10 years? And what can I do to make it do that? Which is such an unhealthy way for us to think about housing.
A very good point. Go ahead, Director. Yeah.
So I'd really like to jump in. Just a quick note, because Carl is 100% on point with that. And I think one of the things that is an example is going back to like lack of wealth within the Black community. Majority of our money within the Black community is tied up in our homes. And in many cases, that's why you see such the home ownership rates among Blacks is, many people say, we'll give numbers pushing it into like the 1960s. We still, as a collective, have still not come out of the last recession. And so dealing with that and dealing with the housing instability that we have right now, it just compounds on some of the issues that families are dealing with in our communities today. So totally agree.
Yeah, Director, do you feel like there has to be some sort of fundamental reshaping or altering of, going back, more to what Rashida was saying about like, I mean, how we're functioning, going back to some of what I was saying earlier too, about like, things like the kinds of habits and tendencies that are growing more this sort of HGTV habit now of like,
Yeah.
we gotta flip house, gotta do this, gotta
Yeah.
gentrify or reverse gentrify. I mean,
Yeah.
is your agency kind of like taking a look at that and saying, hey, you know what, we need to kind of like totally like alter this landscape in a fundamental way?
Yeah, we're focused. Our focus right now is. Let me even take a step back.
Yeah.
One of the main things that we have to do, and it's not just Delaware State Housing Authority. While I am a cabinet, I'm in the cabinet of the governor. There's still 4 other housing authorities in our state, right? And so we have to work together, but collectively, nationwide, I think we need to rethink and reimagine housing or what it's going to look like 30 years from now, 40 years from now. We have to be very intentional in the works that we're doing, and recognize, because also for someone like me, I was just speaking with my director of development about this the other day. I like seeing things immediately. I want to see something now. I want to see houses up now. I want to see people in homes. But it's the realness is it's going to take, if we close on a deal today, it's still going to take almost 18 months, 2 years before a development is finished, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to have fortitude. We have to have long-term planning, and we have to understand that it's not just what meets you at the eye at the moment. And so that comes in a variety of ways. That comes in a proper, many of my developers will be familiar with QAP and just how do you get out plans for what development is going to look like, how you're going to work with developers, how you're going to work to make sure that people are able to get become first-time home buyers and move into local areas. How do you deed restrict in some cases so that it doesn't become a part of that speculation model where you have properties that are able to be sold in local communities for a low number to get first-time home buyers in, but then they become victim of I want to flip my house, I want to do all these different things. So stabilizing neighborhoods so that they just don't become large impoverished rental markets. Essentially, that's what we have in the neighborhoods where I grew up. So these are some of the things that we're trying to do, but it just takes the intentionality and the wherewithal to think about this as like a 30-year plan, a 40-year plan, because that's how long it's going to take us in many cases to get out of the situation. Not just, we all have money as states, our budgets are looking better, but it's not just going to happen now. It's going to take decades to do.
Also, we had Debbie Ann Page from CSGE's Council on Communities of Color asking about estate planning or the lack thereof. It leaves a lot of housing vulnerable when a family member passes away. This is a big problem in the Black community. We don't talk about this enough, but we've even had some very high-profile celebrity African Americans, Black Americans who didn't have the estate in order, and it's still creating a mess to this very day. Does anyone have a thought about that? Anyone want to jump in? Representative, if you had any thoughts with that estate planning dilemma, particularly that Black communities face?
It starts, I think, with the basic financial literacy. And I said, communities that have been locked out of, basic mortgages and banking products, whether checking and savings and credit. I can understand why we are far behind the curve in understanding about estate planning. So I think it's just about an overall financial literacy and not being surprised that we're not thinking about the generational wealth that we are passing along, given the fact that we have never had wealth from the very beginning. So I recognize the difficulty and just something that we have to do. As a matter of fact, it's something that I'm very close to. It's with even my own grandmother's house. So I understand this from both a macro level and a very personal level.
Yeah. Anyone else wanted to jump on that question? Carl?
Yeah, this makes me think about an earlier question that was asked about housing problems in rural areas. And I know that Black communities in rural areas suffer from something called, there's a legal concept called heirs property, where The property is inherited and like it's shared by everyone in the family, and then none of them can control it. And this often makes these families very vulnerable to savvy legal operators who are able to essentially steal the land from them. So the stats on the percentage of land in the South that like had been owned by Black families, it's been shrinking for decades, and heirs property is one of the major mechanisms that's driving this. And you know, when we think about the housing crisis in rural areas, it's overwhelmingly in the Black communities of, you know, the Black Belt, moving from North Carolina through Mississippi. It's also in the colonias, you know, so the heavily Mexican communities that are on the border, and tribal areas, you know, in large parts of the North. These are areas that I think don't get discussed very much in the housing affordability crisis, but, you know, each in their own way is suffering from housing deprivation as severe as we see in a lot of our cities.
Yeah, Corin, where do you think we go from here now?
Well, I would invite everybody next Tuesday. Nicole Hannah-Jones will be with us at Habitat talking about this intersection of housing and race. So you're all welcome. You can sign up on our website. But in a much grander, I mean, we've all said it. It's an all play. It is state. It is federal. I mean, we didn't even talk about that, right? But
No.
you know, for housing authorities, for Eugene, you know, the dollars and the commitment have to come at the federal level, flow through the states. There needs to be the commitment there. You know, written down boldly, I think it was Carl that you mentioned, right? That our market is based in housing, right? Like, and we talk about that, like to be able to buy, but stepping back from that, you're exactly right. Like, we strengthen the social safety network around healthcare. We strengthen public education. We strengthen, you know, the affordability of college, and suddenly we're all not competing to buy suddenly the housing market. So how we arrive, I like Eugene's comment of like, it takes fortitude and it's going to take a couple generations. From where I sit, it is no longer something that you can be on the sidelines about. Yeah, it does impact every single person.
Yeah.
Every person.
Rashida, where are we going from here, you think?
Yeah, again, you know, folks have named a lot of the solutions and things that we need to be looking at and scaling up. So I'll just name one. And one, I also just want to put out there, right? We know, right, again, we know what's happening. We know who's suffering, but we also have to ask the question of who's benefiting from these inequities, who's benefiting from the competition, right? And why is it being maintained? But anyway, the solution I'll focus on real quickly, right? Several states and cities have leveraged COVID-19 recovery funds, ARPA funds, to prioritize equitable acquisition strategies. And so, for example, we have the Rhode Island legislator who, in addition to investments in new affordable housing development, allocated $12 million in recovery funds to Rhode Island Housing and Mortgage Finance Corporation in order for them to acquire properties for redevelopment, right? So let's leverage, we have a one-time opportunity. Hopefully it's not one time, right? But the way things go, there's a bunch of money lying around. Folks can get creative with it. There's a lot of flexibility around these dollars. It's not just for you know, rental assistance. You can use them to do equitable acquisition, to build, to preserve. So let's get creative. So that's the call to action for states. I would use.
I'm always saying that, like, the money's always there. There's plenty of money. It's just where it's being circulated to, where it's being whom it's being dispersed to. You know, I'm real curious, because Rashida, you made a real good point. Director, I'll go to you, and if anyone, representative, you want to weigh in after that. We have to ask the question about who's benefiting from these inequities, such as what's created by the housing crisis. It's a very key question, and it's also about, like, we've talked often, Director, about how NIMBYism factors into what's stalling solutions or response. Effective response to the housing crisis. How do we lay out that business case? How do we lay out that business case that says, hey, listen, you can actually benefit more? We're leaving a lot of money and economic growth, GDP, on the table when we engage in this type of NIMBYism. Here's the business case. I mean, there's obviously the moral dimension and, you know, the altruistic aspect of it, that, like, hey, we can't have people unhoused, but it's also, I mean, states, cities, communities, Everyone's losing all sorts of economic growth, even the ones who don't want certain developments in their neighborhood. Like the social costs are going to catch up with you. Something destructive is going to catch up with you. Something very expensive is going to catch up with you at some point if you are not participating in fixing this crisis. Go ahead, Director.
Yeah, so that's a really good point that you brought up, Charles. So it's interesting. I had a conversation with a developer and a couple weeks ago, and he said, I am all in on busting down NIMBY. And I was just, where's this coming from, right? And he says, A, it's killing me, my business, but B, my workforce has to come so far from the other side of the county to come in that it's taking them too long, is messing up my profits, essentially, my margins. And you're starting to see that in a variety of places. And I've had conversations with many community members. This happens in Delaware. I would say the area where you find this the most is in Sussex County, which is our beach area, where eastern side around the water is everyone wants to live there, but everyone is forced to live on the western side. And so the roads aren't properly built to manage everyone coming to and from every day. The people on the eastern side you're not getting the same service that you wanted because it's hard to find people to work there because it's so hard to get people to come in. So all these different things we're having right now issues with in our healthcare system because we cannot find enough people or doctors that can come into certain areas that can still live within 30 minutes, 45 minutes, because A, they can't afford it because they already have $200,000 in debt, let alone they can't take on another $300,000, $400,000 house. So these are the things that you're seeing, the aspect where your normal day in, day out of living is being obstructed by the fact that people cannot serve and service you in your day-to-day daily activities, whether it's your healthcare, whether it's your children's school teacher, whether it's all these, when you go to the store, the restaurant, not having enough servers, like all these things play a major part. And I think people are starting to recognize it. And I think that's one of the things that we have to continue to put out in the forefront. I love what Corinne said about, if you don't want it in the backyard, it's coming to your front yard, but it's coming to your front yard in a variety of different ways. It's the homelessness you see, it's the lack of services that you have, all these different things that tear down your quality of life, whether you like it, know it, or not.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Representative, some parting thoughts on that before we wrap up?
I mean, so you have to appreciate the irony that there's such a major wealth gap that there's many folks that won't even notice it or won't feel it until it becomes inconvenient for them to be able to be served at a restaurant or to be taught. What a world we live in when that is going to be the precipice for why we actually have to make change. And I know you asked a question about who is profiting. I think the other side about that question is, who is losing? And I think it's just a logical extension of what we had just talked about. There is so many folks that are losing money because we hold on to these old policies. In a good example, in Connecticut, there's a major bill called 830G, essentially requires more affordable housing in all of our communities. It is one of the most contentious policies that we have in Connecticut, particularly in our more affluent suburban areas. When these developments get built using the 830G codes, they are fought tooth and nail over and over and over again. And then two things inevitably happen once they get approved. The first is those that fought it typically get themselves on the wait list. The first thing they can do is get their parents on the wait list, or their kids on their wait list, and move their families in as soon as possible because the housing is awesome. And then two, the property values all around the area that the opponents just fought in all rise. So even as they fight against this, they're fighting against their own financial interests, even if they want it because of the quote unquote political consequences. And I think that's really where we start to have a real, what I'll call a coming to Jesus moment, where we have to start to talk about what are we really fighting against? Because we're not fighting about the economics. We're not really fighting about the policy. What we're really fighting it against is hundreds of years of oppression, prejudice, and bias.
Yeah, really. I'm going to give you the final word, Connecticut State Representative Quentin Williams, member of the Connecticut General Assembly, joining us here on our Eco Word Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference panel discussion, Unhoused, how can states fix the housing crisis? A lot going on there, a lot that can be done. Also, we've been hearing from Eugene R. Young Jr. He is the director of the Delaware State Housing Authority, a member of the Delaware governor's cabinet, as he was saying earlier on. And also, we've been hearing from Rashida Phillips, who is a lead researcher at PolicyLink, and Corinne O'Connell is president CEO of Habitat for Humanity Philadelphia. Carl Gershenson is at the eviction lab at Princeton. It's a great conversation. We have to end it there, but really appreciate everyone for joining us today for this live broadcast. Very essential, needed discussion on the housing crisis, unhoused, how can states fix the housing crisis. So I'm sure there's going to be a part 2, part 3. So I'll probably have that in pieces, or I'll be just reconvening this panel at some later point. So thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, excellent. And so also wanted to thank participants who were in Zoom, including some folks who threw some questions and some comments at us in the Zoom group chat. I appreciate you being here. Want to also send a loud shout out to the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, of which Pennsylvania is a member state, and also some territories there, U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and provinces in Canada. So CSG East spanning pretty large. So we've got some stuff going on with these micro summits we've been doing throughout the pandemic, and they've been highly successful. Want to thank Debbie Ann Page of the Council on Communities of Color, founding director of the Council on Communities of Color at CSG East. So thanks so much there, and also all of our other partners as well. Go to ecoword.com for more there. So we're going to actually very shortly, we're going to go to our panelists. You can definitely head out if you need to, so I can give you back the rest of your Friday. Very busy Friday indeed, so appreciate you. We're going to start opening up the phone lines here on WURD. Want to just get some reactions to that conversation while we have about a half hour left until we head into the rest of our WURD programming day. 215-634-8065, 866-361-0900 here on EcoWord Magazine. 215-634-8065, 866-361-0900 here on EcoWord Magazine. We're going to be coming up on a break shortly, but we'll have phone lines open even after that break to get some